Hello, and welcome to our monthly discussion. This month, we are going to cover estate planning awareness because this week is Estate Planning Awareness Week. So we thought, why not cover that in our topic? So estate planning, we wanted to first just kind of touch on what does that really mean? I think a lot of people have various definitions for estate planning, and they don't quite know what it means to them, but it's a broader term than what many people would assume. So in general, estate planning is something that you're doing now to ensure that your wishes are carried out in the future when you're no longer here, or when you're no longer able to make them on your own behalf. So that can cover things such as who will take care of your pets, who are your beneficiaries on your retirement accounts, who will take care of your children if something were to happen while they're minors, and then how will you split up your assets. So we saw quite a few different definitions of it, but the way that we like to think about it is it's basically an umbrella over your life to ensure that what you want to happen is going to happen the way that you would wish it to be. Jared, did you want to elaborate on that a bit further?
And that's exactly, I think it's a nice way to think about it, like an umbrella insurance policy, how that works. It kind of covers all your assets. Well, your estate plan is like that for your whole life. So it goes into whether it's health issues, your children, everything. It's really that insurance policy like for your family and your wishes. And it's so important. I don't think we can emphasize it enough how many people avoid the conversation and put it off and put it off and put it off. So you really want to kind of put it out front and center. If you've already done one, maybe bring it up to be current. And if you haven't, really kind of put it on your to-do list for the weeks and months ahead.
Definitely. And it should jump to the front of the list because it is the most important thing that you should be doing. So to kick it off, we want to do a Q&A session with common questions that we come across in our everyday work. So one of the main ones is, who really needs an estate plan? And the quick and easy answer is everyone, but especially we would probably say just once you become adult age, you should have one in place. That can start out very simple, something as basic as a will. And then obviously it can get a lot more advanced later in life, depending on your assets and the structure of your estate. But we wanted to walk through a couple examples because I think often people think, okay, but this still doesn't apply to me. So let's run through a couple of examples of who in these scenarios would need an estate plan. So one is, do you own a home and have a mortgage? If the answer is yes, you need an estate plan. Do you work for an employer and have an employer-sponsored retirement plan? If the answer again is yes, you need a retirement plan, or you need an estate plan. Do you have kids that are minors? If the answer is yes, again, you need an estate plan. JR has an example that is one that we just came across this month to just kind of drive home why it really is important to have an estate plan. So do you want to walk through that example for us?
It's just a recent example of an unfortunate event where we had a spouse. She unfortunately passed away, in her middle 40s, and left a few young children. And putting everything together now is just a challenge. So the minor children will now have assets because the plan wasn't in place, so that her spouse will have limited access to some of the funds. And now there's guardianship over the assets until the children become older, probate issues because assets weren't organized and put into place, insurance assets. It just becomes a challenge. On the one hand, you're dealing with the tragic loss of life. On the other hand, there was nothing in place, and it just becomes an extra burden on the entire family. And it's a challenge to be dealt with for years and years ahead. Without having plans in place. And again, it's something nobody wants to live through overall, but it's just emphasize the importance at whatever age demographic you happen to be in, how important it is to make sure you plan and have things in place, because it's just such a burden on your entire family for years to come.
And this example is one I think really important to note because there was life insurance here. So it's not that they didn't think ahead, but estate planning is more than just one specific thing putting in place, like a life insurance policy. It's also it's a planning process where you need to bring in your CPA, your attorney, your advisor to coordinate and review everything and make sure everything is titled properly within your estate as well. So this is still a situation where it's not that they weren't thinking ahead, but it still wasn't buttoned up to the point where it should have been, and where it can easily be if you just sit down and walk through the process. So we kind of already covered this one, but what age should you start an estate plan? So the quick answer is as soon as you are a legal adult. And the reason is basically what we outlined above. Most of the time, once you're a legal adult, you have one of those items that we previously mentioned, where it will be imperative to make sure you have one in state so that everything is or in place so that everything is organized. But we have a fun stat that I wanted to show. So I haven't shown this to JR yet, so I want him to guess. But in knowing this and what we talked about previously, that the most basic form in an estate plan is just a will, just making sure you have that in place for just to start out. So what age group do you think would be most important to have a will?
Like for me, again, having young children, I think it's critically important, call it the less than 40 or less than 35 age demographic to, kind of account for the will and who would take care of your children and those kinds of decisions. If something unfortunate were to happen to you and your spouse.
So that is also what I agree with. But based on a survey that was done, I think through 2023, even this is updated. But based on a recent survey, the demographic that pretty much is starting kids, they only 24% of them actually have a will in place. That obviously goes up over time with 72 and over having 81% of people having a will. So we'd argue that obviously when you have minor children, that is a necessity because a will help make sure that a guardian is already listed with who you wish to take care of your kids and making sure that that decision is up to you and no one else. And then later in life, that will help from an estate planning perspective with your assets. So the good news is that on the end of the scale, it looks like it's a pretty good 8 out of 10 people have it in place. But where it really matters most when you have young minor children, that is something that us young families really need to pay attention to and just get something in place. You can always update it, but if you don't have anything at all, that is a problem.
Well, and to the point, Megan, like when you think about wills are really, really important with young children as you build out your estate plan and get towards the end of life or the over 72 bucket in this example. The trust planning and other things dominate what a will is needed for. So it's great to have a will, but if your estate plan isn't current, that's equally a challenge for people that are retired and beyond.
Definitely. Yeah, and those stats would most likely be even lower, but they didn't have any reporting on that. So now let's cover what are the benefits of an estate plan. Jared, do you want to walk through some of the main ones?
Well, and if you look at some of these, we talked about peace of mind and taking care of your children for something to happen. And that's just, I don't think you can emphasize that enough, especially when you have young children. Thinking about court deciding who's going to take over, not following your wishes. You really come back to that umbrella over your family mindset. You want to make those decisions on behalf of your children, not having someone else decide that for you.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at other things, especially with the changes coming in a couple of years, lowering or preventing estate taxes, privacy over the assets. When you use trusts and other vehicles, it's not public knowledge, where probate, again, avoiding probate's a big deal. It costs a lot of money in many cases. It could be very messy and take a long time, but then your assets are public knowledge as opposed to trust. So it's really something that a lot of people don't want out there overall. And then family conflict. I mean, it's something it doesn't matter over the years if it's $5,000 or 50 million. I mean, the family challenges and fights over end of life or estates can be a big problem, and really spelling that out and communicating with your family, your wishes and what's been in place is really helpful to kind of keep the family together for many generations into the future.
Mhm. So now, what is something most people wouldn't think of? So when we were trying to decide what is something kind of unique that we've seen that many people don't think of frequently, it's if you have college-aged kids, sending them off to college can obviously be a very scary endeavor, especially your first time. But having the peace of mind to make sure that you're in the loop is going to be really important. So a healthcare power of attorney can help in that case where if something were to happen and they were to end up having to go to the hospital, the last thing that you would want if they were over legal age, that you couldn't get access to understand what's going on, any information on it. So making sure you have something set up where you'll have access to information in the worst case scenario where you need that will give you that peace of mind, just so that you can always kind of be in the loop and make sure that you can help them in those situations. So what is the most common misstep with estate planning? And this one we could think of three. So Jared, do you want to walk through those?
And if you look at the biggest one is not doing anything, which is many people out there
Mm-hmm.
overall. But again, once you set that one aside, which is kind of the obvious one, other things we've seen a lot of times is once you walk through the process and sign the documents, you assume everything's done. In most cases, you have to retitle assets, you have to update beneficiaries, you have to make a lot of changes. And just by signing the document doesn't mean all of that extra work and follow through gets done. And again, we've seen that unfortunately with a few families over the years, and there's just unnecessary consequences. You've gone through all the time and effort to follow all the way through it is very important. And I think the last one that we've seen a lot of is I already did mine, right? I did it 10 years ago. I went through the whole process. I don't want to think about updating it again, and going through that. But it's critically important if tax laws change, your wishes, your needs, who you might have as trustee, executors, different ages of where beneficiaries get access to money. It's important to stay on top of those and review it every few years to make sure what you decided 10, 15, 20 years ago is still appropriate now and into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime there's life events, right? I mean, whether it's a new child, a new grandchild, changes within marriages, within families, other things like that are really important to make sure your documents and wishes follow through on where you currently are overall. But again, I think it's really important to continue to stay on top of your estate plan once it's in place.
Definitely. Agreed. And then last, we wanted to end on, if I already have an estate planning in place, what should I be asking myself? And there are a few things there. One is, is your estate prepared for the estate and gift tax exemption to be reduced? So JR touched on this a little bit earlier, but at the end of 2025, the estate tax exemption limit is set to cut in half. So that could have a very large impact on your existing estate plan if you haven't took that into consideration. And there might be things that you want to do now to plan accordingly. So that is one. But another one I think that's really, really crucial is communication. So you might have this all in place, but are both you and your spouse, first of all, on the same page and making sure that it's up to date and in line, but also then between generations. So if you've spent all this work putting this in place, saving up all these assets for future generations, are future generations aware of it, for one? Are they prepared for it, for another, especially if it is complex estate? Making sure to communicate early And this could look like a variety of different things. This might not be you telling them how much, but even just helping educate them on entities in place, what they mean, your values, and passing that down can go a long way in helping train and mentor them to be good stewards of your wealth moving forward. So we can't emphasize this enough. Communication, we can discuss various different types of communication and what that might look like, but communication goes a long way to help with making sure that it reduces conflict long-term and confusion.
And one of the question that comes to mind too, Megan, is a very simple one. Do your assets go in trust for the benefit of your children, or do they go outright to your children? Right. And most people, if you ask them, how are you leaving your assets? You say half to each of my children, or a third, a third, a third.
Right.
Which most likely is true, but it's that next step. Is it outright or in trust? And that's a critical piece of information, especially when you're communicating to your children or grandchildren, because if they're doing very well financially already and are on a path to a taxable estate on their own, and then in the future you leave money outright to them, you're making that tax burden far greater. So it's just a simple issue that most people don't think about, but it's very important to double check that question and then verify with your children and grandchildren, or vice versa, up a generation with your parents or grandparents.
In addition to keeping it in trust can also help with creditor protection or ensure that it's a premarital asset. So there's other benefits to keeping it in trust, even if you're not in a taxable estate or if your heirs aren't in a taxable estate. That's something you want to take into consideration and be aware of as well. All right, so that's all we had for this month. We have a few topics coming up where we might dig a little bit deeper into estate planning as well. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and thanks for joining.
Hurry up and get started if you haven't already. Thank you.